Port Clarence is a fine natural harbor on the Seward Peninsula, and the whaling ships used it as a rendezvous while waiting for tenders. Sometimes it would be almost a month before the last whaling ship left Port Clarence for the Arctic, and it often happened that about 20 whalers, both steam and sailing ships, would be waiting at one time in the harbor. These were not ships that had wintered in the Arctic. These whalers were either staying for the summer whaling season only or were on their way to winter in the Arctic. After the trip from San Francisco, they needed provisions and coal for themselves, and often they would carry supplies or men to ships that were staying at Herschel Island. At that time, the natives from miles and miles around would go to Port Clarence and set their tents up on the beach to trade. The native women would make boots and fur clothing for the ship's crews, and usually the Eskimos would be paid with provisions or whiskey, but mostly whiskey. And every night on that beach, it sounded as if all bedlam was being turned loose. During that time, the men from the different ships would have baseball games on the beach. And that year, I remembered Grampus's crew played the Narwhale's crew on the 4th of July. I was chosen as umpire. The Narwhale's crew won the game without any trouble, but I made up my mind that never again would I umpire a game between two ships' crews. During the first part of July, as soon as the ships received their supplies and provisions, they sailed away to fight their way through the ice. They planned to go to the eastward of Herschel Island, where they would hunt the bowhead whales. But first they went to Herschel Island itself, so that the ships that had been wintering there could get mail, coal, and provisions, and replace some of the men who were to return to the big outside. The year of 1895 proved a very icy year along what was called the East Shore, or Alaskan shore, of the Bering Strait. The whaling ships in those days usually sailed from San Francisco as early as March. If winds were favorable, the steamers would use their sails and save their coal. Otherwise, they would use their engines. The sailing ships had to use what the good Lord sent them, favorable or otherwise, and I can assure you, under either sail or steam, it was a long, rough voyage across the North Pacific Ocean at that time of the year. It took 20 days or more to reach Unimak Pass in the Aleutian Islands, through which ship passed into the Bering Sea. The whalers wanted to reach the ice and cruise along its outside edge in the end of April and May and June, so that if they were lucky, they would start catching whales early in the season. There were years when this plan was very successful. This was called spring whaling. It took place on the Siberian side of the Bering Strait, the west shore. The spring winds drove the ice off that shore early because, according to old whaling skippers, the water was much sharper or deeper there than on the Alaskan side. In any case, the bowheads would follow the west shore up to the East Cape, Russia, then across to Point Hope, Alaska, and go up the coast to Point Barrow. From Point Barrow, they would go east to the Beaufort Sea. The ice is always traveling north in late spring, and the Genie got surrounded. We were floating in a hole in the ice off Icy Cape, and it was a question whether we would be able to get out of it or not. We could see the whalers on the outside of the ice, and they were trying to reach us but couldn't. Captain Mason asked another man and me if we would take a letter requesting help over the ice and deliver it to the captain of any ship belonging to the Pacific Steam Whaling Company. The two of us were gone 8 hours and had to return. We couldn't make it. Captain Mason thanked us for our work by calling us a goddamn pair of good-for-nothings. After we had spent about 3 weeks in the ice, the wind shifted and loosened up the ice, and we managed to work the ship through to clear water. From then on, part of the time we had clear water, and part of the time we had to work the ice, shove our way through it. The steamships of the whaling fleet, with their power and with iron shoeing on the bows, could cut through 5 inches of soft ice, but it was slow going. Finally, in about the middle of August, we reached Herschel Island. We arrived at Pauline Cove, a fine natural harbor. It was small, but the water was deep right up to the beach. When we got there, the Genie hauled up broadside almost to the shore. We had 2 large spars. From the deck of the ship, we extended a gangplank about 12 feet wide to the beach. On the beach, in the charge of a former whaling captain, were large warehouses where provisions were stored. We unloaded the merchandise from the warehouses on the inshore side of the Genie, and on the other side we loaded coal and provisions on the whalers. onto the whalers whose crews were eager to sail to the whaling grounds. Fred and I both joined the Mary D. Hume. Fred, now recovered from his fight with Captain Mason, was to be a sailor, and I was to be a member of the Black Squad, the engine room crew. The Mary D. Hume, a 90-foot schooner, was commanded by Captain George Levitt, one of the finest and most capable men I have ever had the pleasure of sailing with. He had the welfare of his men at heart and treated and fed them fine. He was easy to get along with. He demanded obedience but wouldn't punish a man unless he just had to. In connection with that, there was one little incident that I can't forget, and I think it's worth retelling. A good deal of drinking was taking place along the beach, and one of the sailors of our crew went ashore without permission. We'll call him Jack. Captain Levitt sent for him to come back aboard the ship, but Jack paid no attention to the captain's order. Only when he had finished his spree did Jack come aboard. The top engine room of the Mary D. Hume had settees around it, and it was used as sort of a recreational hall. Captain Levitt, some officers, and I were sitting there talking when Jack finally returned to his ship. "Captain," he said, "did you wish to see me?" "Why, yes, Jack," the captain answered. "Here, sit down." We continued our conversation, and Jack had his say as well as the rest of us. Finally, the captain got up and went into his cabin. He came back with a pair of irons and a piece of emery paper, handed these to Jack, telling him to polish them up. Jack's face flushed. He took the irons and started right in to polish them. When he had finished, he told the captain, "Very well, Jack," Captain Levitt answered. "Just put them on and come with me." He put Jack in the run. That is the part of the whaling ship that is underneath the cabin, where small stores are kept. It is very dark. Jack had a pannikin of water and some bread each evening. Every third day he got a square meal. The captain warned all of us that we must not give Jack anything to eat, or else we'd be put down in the run with him. At the end of the week, Captain Levitt called Jack up and asked him if he knew why he had been punished. Jack said he did. Captain Levitt immediately took off Jack's irons, told him to go forward, and warned him not to go ashore again, to stay as long as he pleased without permission. Jack was a splendid sailorman and a favorite with all on the ship. I am quite sure that no one was more surprised than Jack about his punishment. I honestly believe that Jack Levitt really didn't want to punish Jack so severely, but he had to set an example, as we had quite a few new sailors aboard. The Mary D. Hume was one of the last ships to get her coal and provisions. As soon as we were supplied, we immediately steamed away for the whaling grounds to the east of Herschel Island. I was as eager as anybody to get started. The price of baleen, as I recall, was about $5 a pound at the time. Baleen, generally known as whalebone, is the flexible bow-shaped plates suspended from the upper jaw of the skull of the bowhead. For the whale, baleen serves as a food strainer. For the whaling companies, baleen was a product that could be used in many ways, but its biggest use by far was for corset stays. A grown bowhead can have as many as 600 plates of baleen in its mouth, the longest up to 13 feet long. A large whale produces as much as a ton of whalebone. Most all the ships that were there ahead of us had caught some whales, but not many. We finally caught 2. That was my first whaling season, and barely 4 weeks were spent in going after whales. Then it was time to return to Herschel Island to get ready for wintering. 15 vessels were scheduled to remain at Herschel Island that winter, but only 13 did because 2 got caught in the ice at Cape Perry, about 340 miles to the east. Of those at Herschel Island, 10 were steamers and 3 were sailing ships. Crowbills, we called them. On our way back, we went in close to the beach, sending boats ashore so men could gather driftwood, because we wanted to take a shipload of it back to the island to use later on for fuel. As soon as we reached Herschel Island, we discharged this wood and went back for another load. Finding wood was no problem, but we had an awful time getting it on account of mosquitoes. Some of the men's faces were swollen so badly that we could scarcely recognize them. After putting the second load of wood ashore, we commenced to prepare for wintering in earnest, building our shelter deck. First of all, the sails were unbent and sent down, and also the yards. To unbend the sails means to remove them from the yards. A yard is a long spar attached to it at its midpoint to a mast. The top of a square sail is attached to the yard. The yards were laid fore and aft from the poop, a superstructure on the stern, to the fo'c'sle head. Then the sails were tightly stretched over these yards and battened down. We also used some supplies from the warehouse in preparing our winter shelter. Two windows were made on the port side of the shelter because later on that would be the sunny side. On the starboard side, a door was installed. We made a heating stove out of a 100-gallon oil tank. This part of the ship in winter quarters was called the bull room. It was nice and warm. The carpenter's bench was there, and that's where dog sleds were built and any work done that was necessary for the ship. There were one day watchmen and one night watchman to take care of that part of the ship and to keep the fires going. In the evenings, the men and their friends from other ships would congregate there to play cards and other games. Another part of the winter preparation was construction of a snow house around the stern of the ship. This house was over the stern and propeller, and the ice around that part of the ship had to be frequently sawed out and carried away so that the rudder and propeller could be kept free all winter. That area was called the stern hole. This work was necessary because if the rudder and propeller were allowed to freeze in the ice, or if the ship was to jump, which often happened when the tide rose and fell, it would snap off both rudder and propeller, which could not be replaced in the Arctic Ocean. Every morning, one of the firemen in the engine room would turn the engine over to make sure that the propeller was clear. Once some of us were in the fire room playing cards when the ship gave a jump, and the report sounded as if it had come from a cannon on one of Uncle Sam's battleships. We all stampeded up to the deck, having never before experienced that effect of changing tide. Later, we found out that that was a frequent occurrence in all the ships. Below deck in the engine room, the Black Squad had its own responsibilities in preparing for winter. Steam was kept in the boilers until we were absolutely certain that there would be no more need of the engine. Then the captain would give the chief engineer orders to see that the fires were hauled and the boilers blown down. Next, all joints and unions were hauled and the boilers blown down. Next, all joints and unions and the pipes were broken so that all the water could be drained out. This was done on account of contraction and expansion. If any water was left in any pipes or cylinders, it would freeze and most likely burst, causing a lot of damage that could not be readily taken care of at Herschel Island. All parts of the engine were heavily coated with grease or white lead to prevent rust. Then a large stove was installed in the fire room to be taken care of by one fireman during the night and by another during the day. This was to keep the temperature in the engine and fire room as even as possible. That's the arrangement that all the ships followed while in winter quarters. Finally, the young ice commenced to make in the bay, and each ship took the position that it was to be frozen into during the long winter.